Let me get my housekeeping slides up. And there's green. Right, people are starting to join. Welcome everyone. I've got 50 already, joining very quickly. If you're happy to find the chat and pop in there your name, where you're joining from in the country and what your role is, it's always lovely to see where people are joining these webinars from. I'll give it just another minute or so for other participants to join, because I know we're expecting a few more than have joined us so far. When you put your Emma and Godfrey, I think when you put your name and location in the chat, you put it just to the panelists. If you want everyone to be able to see it, then put it into the chat marked all panelists and attendees, and then we can all see each other's details. Hello, David. Hello, Maggie. Hello, Mary. Hello, Godfrey. People joining us from all around. Right, how are we doing? Got well over 50 participants. I think I'll start with the housekeeping, and no doubt some other people will be joining over the next couple of minutes. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the first of our special series of Land and Nature webinars. We've got 12 webinars during the week this week, timed to coincide with Church's Count on Nature. And today is our kickoff topic on a very serious kickoff topic: nature and climate, twin crises and shared solutions. A very quick bit of housekeeping. We'll be using the Q&A for the questions today rather than the chat. So please, if you move your mouse around, find the Q&A. That's where you can type in your questions. You'll also see other people's questions there, and you can click the thumbs up next to them if it's a question you're particularly interested in. And the ones with the most clicks will rise to the top, and that's where we'll focus our question time at the end when Peter's finished speaking. After today, I'll send everyone who has registered the slides, any links that are shared in the chat, and I'll also send you a link through to a short feedback form. It's really useful for us to know whether our webinars are hitting the spot. And it'll take me a few days because there are 12 webinars this week, but all of the recordings will end up on our website on the same page where you booked to come today. As you can see, we've got a lot going on this week. This is just a very quick listing of the 12 webinars this week. Church's Count on Nature has started at the weekend. We've got well over 300 churches around the country who are doing biological recording this week. And then we have our whole series of webinars alongside that. If there are other topics here that catch your eye, I'll put the link through to the webinar page in the chat when I've finished, and you can click through and book on for other topics later in the week. And then on Saturday, Sheffield Diocese are running an online eco-church festival linked to Church's Count on Nature. And again, I'll put the link through to that page when I've finished speaking. And it would be lovely to see a lot of you there online and in Sheffield on Saturday. Not to do with land and nature, but just a quick plug for other webinars that we've got coming up. We've got a new session on heat pumps in the middle of July. We've got 3 new webinars on eco-church over the end of June, beginning of July. And we've got our new environmental fundraising sessions in September. And again, I'll put the link to that and how you can book into the chat when I've finished. Right, onto the main event. if you come to one of my webinars before, you'll know me, Catherine Ross. I work in the Cathedral and Church Buildings Division and lead on environmental matters for them. And I'm part of the team that work on the Church of England's Environment Programme. But more importantly, our speaker today is Pete Brotherton, who's so expert and so interesting on this subject. Pete has got two hats on that make him perfect for speaking to us today. The first is the Science and Climate Change Director at Natural England. And the second is that he's our Diocesan Environment Officer for Peterborough Diocese. Around the country, we have a network of Diocesan Environment Officers, and they're just the most incredible people leading on environmental issues in their diocese. If you don't know who your local DEO is, I'd really recommend you finding them, because they're just, they're such brilliant people and so passionate about environmental issues. Without any further ado, let me stop sharing my slides and hand over to you, Pete, to take us away.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that over-generous introduction. Let me just see if that works. Is that working? Great, thank you. So it's a huge privilege to be the first speaker in this series, and there's a wonderful comprehensive and kind of interconnectivity associated with the series that we've got this week. So congratulations to Catherine and others for setting it up. And I'm going to try very hard not to overlap with what the other speakers will say throughout the week. And I hope many of you will be able to join or listen to those talks later on. But my talk, as Catherine has said, is very much to try and set the scene to the challenge around the climate change and nature loss as joint crises. I'm hoping my slides will advance in a second. There we go. So I'm going to start off by saying a bit about where we are in terms of nature loss and climate change, both from UK and global perspectives, and go on to describe these as linked crises. I think many people are often interested in one or the other, and I'll try and make the case to you that it's a bit meaningless thinking them as separate crises, because they're so interlinked, both in terms of their causes and in terms of their solutions. And then finally, I hope, after what may be at times, well, if not depressing, a bit challenging in terms of some of the stark evidence that I'll present, I'll say a little bit about why I think there is nonetheless some cause for hope. So, looking back briefly, 2020 was meant to be a super year for the environment. We were meant to have two big international events. The United Nations Conference of the Parties, the COP15 on biodiversity, was due to meet in Kunming in China, and COP26 was going to happen in Glasgow, where the world leaders would come together to talk about climate change. Clearly, because of COVID, neither of these happened, but those two events are happening this year. And perhaps slightly strangely, I personally feel that that delay is going to prove to be a good thing. It'll prove to be a good thing for because it has given the world longer to digest the wealth of evidence that has been that was published towards the end of last year, actually in anticipation that these events would happen. But actually, politicians need to think about these things, don't they? So it's no bad thing that that evidence has been produced, is being updated this year as we speak, but has been cogitated on for a little bit longer. But secondly, the framing of those events is now rather different with a Biden presidency than we would have had under a Donald Trump presidency. And I'll come back and say a little bit more about that later. But where are we then? Talking about nature first, those publications that were produced last year painted a pretty bleak picture as to where the world has got to in terms of its global commitments for nature and climate. The world is good at making commitments for nature and climate and other forms of environmental harm, I would say. It's got a good track record going back to the Earth Summit back in 1992 in Rio, and since then has made an awful lot of promises to tackle biodiversity loss and indeed climate change and other sources of environmental concern. It's not very good at keeping those promises. So at international level, all 20 of the targets agreed back in 2010 in Japan, in the Aichi region of Japan, the so-called Aichi targets, were missed. And the UK's government's own assessment is that we missed 75% of those targets. In the UK, nature is in quite serious decline. Over 50% of all species are currently in decline, and the UK State of Nature report that that was published last year is a very good source of information on that. We know of over 500 species that have been lost completely from England, and that slightly muddy picture down to the right-hand side of your screen, I don't know if you can make it out. I'll try waving my cursor over it and hope that you can see it. There's something there that's a bit of a mouth with tentacles coming out. This is a species called the Ival sea anemone. This is the best picture, I think, that exists in the world of this image and of this species, and there'll probably never be any more, because this was a global extinction that happened in England from a lagoon in West Sussex back sometime probably in the late 1970s or early 1980s, and people have tried very hard to find it ever since, but haven't managed to do so. That's a global extinction event that happened in the UK within many of our lifetimes. 500 species have been lost completely from England. Fortunately, most of those are not global extinction events, but another 1,400 are threatened. And we know of over 500 species from fewer than 5 sites, including some of them actually from churchyards only. 40% of UK, over 40%, sorry, it's actually over 50% of UK species are in decline, I apologize, including many familiar, once common species, such as the hedgehogs and sparrows. And as a general rule of thumb, if a species has common in its name, so common cuckoo or common scoter, common frog, common toad, and so on, it's usually on our list of threatened species now. So our widespread species that gave us abundance and delight in nature have been seriously, are in serious declines. And there are very few places now where children can run through clouds of butterflies or sit amongst rainbows of flowers and really engage with nature in abundance. And we've lost that experience, and we're losing these species. 25% of UK mammals, such as the hedgehog, are now threatened with extinction. And those losses play out at local scales as well, with one plant being lost per English county every 2 years. And the rates are slightly higher in the south and the east, and slightly lower in the north and west. Those changes are largely happening because of the way we are using our land. And it's just worth saying that we started early. So we've seen large and historic and ongoing changes to our habitats. Over 95% of our fens were lost, mostly in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Most of our lowland heathland, many flower-rich meadows have been lost in the 20th century, and similarly lowland ponds and many of our hedgerows. And this has left us as one of the world's most nature-depleted nations. England is the most nature-depleted nation across the UK. But those scales of habitat loss are a warning sign to us, because on average, island biogeography theory would tell us that if you lose 90% of your habitat, you'd expect to lose eventually 50% of species. Those losses don't happen immediately. Species are pretty good at clinging on in little pockets, but over time, that's what we might predict. Now, fortunately, we've lost nothing like 50% of our species, even for some of these habitats where we've suffered really severe losses. But those historic habitat losses represent an extinction debt that we need to pay off. We need to avoid paying, and we can pay that off by restoring habitat. So in other words, if we stop the habitat losses that we have now, we will continue to lose species. We need more nature to stop further species extinctions. At global level, the situation is also quite bleak. We know of over 1 million species that are threatened with extinction. This graph is for the vertebrates, so that's the bony species, fish, amphibians, birds, and mammals, species that we often know best. And we know that the abundance of mammals has declined by of vertebrates, sorry, has declined by nearly 70%. The data for other groups are less robust, but particularly worrying signs are out there for plants and especially for insects, where there are some really severe local declines are being noted in areas where insect populations are being monitored. So lots of species are declining very quickly. Again, habitat loss is the primary cause of change, and our global deforestation rates are slowing, but they're still at about 10 million hectares per year. That's losing the equivalent of, if a hectare is roughly a football pitch, that's losing the equivalent of a football pitch of forest every 3 seconds. The areas of wetlands proportionately have declined even worse than our forest habitats. We've lost over 35% of them between 1970 and 2015, and only 23% of rivers now flow uninterrupted into the sea if you take rivers that are longer than 1,000 kilometers. All these data are from Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, and you know, do dip into that if you're interested in finding out more. But profound changes happening to nature. And of course, these are largely happening because of the way we are capturing the Earth's resources, and the scale at which we're doing that is simply staggering. So if we weigh all humans on a scale and took our biomass, we would now outweigh all mammals from mice to whales nearly 10 times. Our livestock that we keep to feed us and that we cut down nature to often feed, our cows and sheep, the mammal livestock, outweigh us nearly 2 times. So overall, if you took the entire stock of all mammals, only 4% of them, only 4% of that weight now is accounted for by all the wild mammals combined. Similarly, if we look at chickens, the domestic biomass of chickens alive at any time is 3 times greater than that of all wild birds. Even if you include all the seabird colonies, all the penguin colonies, our chickens outweigh all of those 3 times over. So the scale at which we've captured the Earth's resources for our species use is simply staggering and quite worrying. And those losses matter because biodiversity and nature underpin human life. We think of, the scientists describe these as ecosystem services and identify broadly 4 types of ecosystem services. Our supporting services that contribute nutrient cycling, soil formation, and so on. Regulating services that provide us with clean air, clean water, pollination, and things that really drive our systems. The more direct services that provide us with our food, the provisioning services, or fuel and so on, and medicines, and of course the cultural services that are really hard to put a price on, but are hugely important just in terms of our well-being and spiritual lives. To describe some of these effects in more detail, we know that somewhere between $235 and $577 billion of crops are at risk from pollinator loss. 4 billion people rely on nature for their primary medicines around the world. 70% of our cancer drugs come from nature. And that shouldn't really surprise us. After all, other species represent a natural experiment for many of the diseases that we will encounter in our lifetimes. Species have been fighting cancer, they've been fighting viruses, and so on for billions of years throughout their history, just as we have. So it's not surprising that other species should have found solutions to these, and we lose those species at our peril before we've even discovered what many of the solutions that they hold may be. And in a perhaps a particularly prescient example of how harming nature can cause problems for us, most scientists think that that coronavirus was the product of a virus crossing over from bats and caused by us using nature in harmful ways, us bringing nature far too close in contact with us through ecosystem degradation and through us exploiting wildlife and thereby exposing us to diseases that we shouldn't have. And coronavirus is perhaps the one that's affected us most in the UK, but there are many other viruses, from SARS to Nipah virus and others, that have all crossed over from nature. And the next pandemic will come from nature. And we can either wait for that to come or tackle that sooner rather than by tackling those root causes. 2 billion people around the world rely on wood fuel, and we know that the loss of coastal habitats will put 100 to 300 million people at risk of coastal flooding. The World Global Environment Forum estimates that about 44 trillion of economic value generation, about half of all global GDP, is moderately or highly dependent on nature. And because of those links, and because nature is generally most used, at least at proximate level, by many of the world's poorest people, the UN estimates that biodiversity loss will reduce our ability to meet 14 out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has set itself. So turning to the other crisis of climate change, many of you will, I'm sure, be familiar with some of these slides that I'm about to put up, but let's just remind ourselves of what's going on. These are actual measurements taken from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii of monthly average carbon dioxide levels since the late 1950s. And we can see that we're rushing up. In my lifetime, I remember the call, could we halt, could we stop these emissions at 400 parts per million of CO2? We're way past that already and continuing to go up. If we overlay these this graph with evidence from ice core data, we can see that where we are now is way above where we have been for the last nearly million years. Now, modern humans have been around for somewhere between 100 and 150,000 years. So we're part of this last bit. The air that we're breathing today has never been breathed before by human beings in terms of the average levels of carbon dioxide that we're all experiencing. So we've never lived through anything like this in terms of that atmospheric change. Now, I always think this is really cool, actually, so I'll say a little bit about it. That same ice core data from which the scientists extract those tiny, tiny bubbles of air to measure the carbon dioxide levels going right back 800,000 years, can also give us a measure of temperature, because oxygen exists in two isotopic forms, a heavier form and a lighter form of oxygen, and they precipitate in rainfall at different rates depending on the temperature. So scientists using that same ice core can match the concentration of carbon dioxide with the prevailing temperature when that ice was formed. And that gives us this pattern. And it's a really clear pattern that carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is a really important driver of temperature change. And we're still, we know that there's a lag in how the Earth warms to increases in carbon dioxide, and there's a huge risk. And what scientists, of course, worry about is that we're going to catch up with the expected change and that anomaly that we see there. We're now at about 1.2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, and our rate of warming is at about 0.2 degrees per decade. And even at this 1.2 degrees, we're seeing massive change. And it's really important to remember that that figure represents an average change for the world, but the world isn't an average place. The world is a very varied place. Most of the Earth, nearly 3/4 of it, is oceans, and oceans absorb most of the global warming that's already happened, but they also warm less quickly than land. So 1.2 degrees average doesn't play out as 1.2 degrees for us on land. And already we're seeing changes of up to 3 degrees as an average change in some land areas, and the higher latitudes, so the poles, are areas that are warming most quickly. And of course, I mean, you could choose any number of the extreme things that we are having, the extreme differences that we're seeing. We're seeing a combination of both gradual change that's having profound effects, such as on the thinning of ice sheets and the stability of those ice sheets, which is hugely worrying in terms of the likely impact upon global sea levels and global sea level rise. I live in the town of Peterborough. My house is about 8 meters above sea level, but there are large communities around the world who are at risk of relatively small amounts of sea level rise. We're seeing hottest winters again and again on record. The Arctic burning in the permafrost areas, which has never been known to happen in the past, converting what was once important carbon stores into carbon sinks. So areas of permafrost are already releasing carbon dioxide when they should be storing it, and those places are even burning. We're familiar with the California situation, Brazil's Amazons, Brazil's rainforest burning more than ever. Could have chosen Australia, couldn't I? And the biggest impact that we've always predicted would happen, but it causes the greatest human tragedy, are the extreme weather events that happen with far more frequency. And those simply happen because there is a lot more energy in the atmosphere as the atmosphere warms. So storms are more frequent and pick up more water, so create more rainfall, the winds blow harder, and so on. So we need to expect and need to plan for more severe weather events. And climate change now largely thought of as the most underreported humanitarian crisis around the world. And it's really why the likes of Christian Aid and Oxfam and others have become so interested in and focused on climate change, because their work is increasingly impossible because of the changes that are happening to local climates, and the rules that people have followed, traditional approaches to knowing how weather systems work and so on, no longer apply for a lot of people around the world. And there are more environmental refugees alive in the world today than there are refugees from all the world's wars. So this is why global commitments and real change on issues such as climate change and nature are so important. Perhaps the most important commitment in recent times was the Paris Agreement, which was to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. Why 1.5 degrees better than 2 degrees? I mean, it's worth saying 1.5 degrees is still really awful. I think it's fair to say we will continue to see all those things that I've just been talking about more frequently and with greater severity. But 2 degrees is utterly catastrophic for many people. So at 1.5 degrees, and that the report there, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on global warming of 1.5 degrees sets this out really clearly. But we will see fewer extreme events, so we'll have a reduction in storms, floods and droughts. And importantly, we'll see cooler, extremely hot days. So it's these extremes that really drive mortality. A gradual change of 1 degree might not have that much effect, but it's those big events that really change things. And that's true for nature as much as it is for people. So if nature is clinging on in particular places, it just needs one big storm event or a drought or a big fire to wipe populations out entirely. We'll see 0.1 meter less global sea level rise by 2100, which will expose 10 million fewer people around the world to the related risks of sea level rise. About 2 million kilometers squared less permafrost will melt. And coral reef, I don't know if this is good or bad. It's a bit of a mixed, it's a hard thing to take, isn't it? Even at 1.5 degrees, we're going to lose probably up to 90% of our coral reefs. But scientists think we'll lose 99% at 2 degrees. So that's a change, I think, worth trying to achieve. And 1.5 degrees is going to be really hard. Models, we've had climate models going back for 30 to 40 years now. The history of models is they tended to be right, and we've got better at modeling. If you look closely at the models, we've tended to track the upper limit. So I'm sure you can visualize the model trajectories, which always give a kind of a worse and bad case scenario and a midline. We've tended to generally be above the midline when it comes to how the Earth has warmed, suggesting that maybe some of the feedback loops that have been warned about may already be kicking in. But even at 1.5 degrees, the scenarios mapped out in climate, there's a 50% chance of overshoot there. So, so aiming for 1.5 degrees is surely the least we should do. So let me collide these for you. And I always think, looking back in the last 2 or 3 years, one of the things that has really struck me as somebody who's worked on nature for a very long time and felt, if you like, the kind of the forgotten cousin to the big climate change agenda one of the things that's really struck me is the way climate and nature has collided in the public consciousness. So it's the Extinction Rebellion, isn't it, that people sign up to, and young people talk a lot about the ecological crisis and climate crisis. So people are getting it, and it's really great that they are getting it. I think of them as very much two sides of the same coin, with shared causes and shared solutions. They each make each other worse, it's worth saying. So conversion of natural habitats accounts for 15% of all global emissions. That change represents a loss of habitats for species, and in itself affects species. But that 15% of global emissions, of course, drives climate change. That impacts the range in which species can safely live, decreasing ecosystem function and resilience, and decreasing the ability of our natural systems to absorb the carbon dioxide that our activities are emitting. So you get this feedback loop and this vicious spiral of environmental harm, with one making the other worse, which in turn makes the other worse. Over 50% of current global emissions are absorbed by our seas and our and nature on land. So it's good functioning of these systems is already really important to us reducing the amount of climate change that will happen. And as we harm those systems, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot even more than we already have. So having healthy functioning ecosystems is key. And if we look at the top actions that are needed to respond to climate change and biodiversity and nature loss, they overlap enormously. So this is quite a complicated diagram, but let me just briefly talk it through it. So in orange are actions that are needed to tackle climate change. So they include reducing F gases. These are the fluorocarbons. Everybody probably remembers chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, that were damaging the ozone layer. The world banned those, and it's great that it did. But there are a number of other fluorocarbons that are still permitted. They're hugely important greenhouse gases, and some estimates are that banning F gases would reduce global warming by 0.5 degrees on its own. We need more renewable energy sources and energy efficiency measures and carbon capture and storage. Over on the green side are things that we need to do to tackle biodiversity loss that include reduced pollution, stopping unsustainable hunting and fishing. Unsustainable use is a particularly important driver in our oceans, where more than sea use change, it's the primary driver of biodiversity loss. We need to tackle invasive species, particularly on island places, and we need to better connect people and nature. But in the blue area, this big chunk in the middle, those are all actions that deliver for both climate and biodiversity loss. And if we approach those actions in ways that recognize that link, we will get better outcomes for our climate and biodiversity. And in the bottom part of this, these four big areas are what we refer to as nature-based solutions, where nature, tackling actions to directly restore nature can also deliver really important benefits to people and in terms of our climate change response. There's no route to net zero without tackling biodiversity loss. And if there's one thing you take from today's talk, I hope it'll be that. Please just remember that we have to tackle nature loss if we're going to get to net zero. Under challenging scenarios, if we really go flat out on nature restoration, there's predictions that could absorb 20% of current global emissions. Only 20%. That nature is not the silver bullet. I'll quickly add, nature is a really important part of the solution, not least because if we keep using nature, we're going to, as I said earlier, we're going to keep driving climate change in the wrong way. But nature itself will not provide all the solutions to climate change. We need to reduce emissions. We need all the things that many of you will be doubtless aware of, as per the previous slide. The UK Climate Change Committee has embraced this and recommends that we need to plant 30,000 hectares of woodlands by 2025, increasing to 50,000 hectares by 2035, lifting our overall woodland cover from about 12% across the UK now to somewhere between 17 and 18%. So a big change. So this is changing our landscapes, and we need to welcome that change when it happens. A really important action, possibly even more important than planting lots of woodland, is restoring our peat. There's far more carbon in our peat than in our woodlands. In fact, there's more carbon in our peat than in the forests of Germany and France combined, and they have a lot more forests than we do. At the moment, peat should be a fantastic store of nature, and it's one of the few habitats that, if it's functioning well, will continue to accumulate carbon. So a woodland is a brilliant way of locking up carbon. If we plant a new woodland, it'll continue to lock up carbon and lock up more carbon for probably around 100 to 300 years, depending on the type of woodland. But then it plateaus off, it levels off, because as the system gets into balance, and it won't lock up further carbon, but it'll represent a fantastic store. Peat accumulates carbon absolutely indefinitely. And peat, together with a few marine habitats, are some of the few things that does this. However, at the moment, instead of locking up carbon, peat, we've converted through our damaging activities on peat, most peat in the UK, into a net source of carbon emissions instead of a sink. And so it is producing carbon dioxide instead of locking it up. And this is a huge priority for change, and the Climate Change Committee has recommended this trajectory of change to try and deliver on that. And worth saying in this context that the government has announced a £640 million fund called the Nature for Climate Fund, which is targeting woodland creation and peatland creation. It won't do anything like all of it, but it's a good start. So nature can help mitigate or reduce climate change, but climate change is with us. We can't stop climate change. Those days are long gone. We have to deal with climate change, and nature can also provide many of those solutions that we need to dealing with climate change, or adapting to climate change, as we might call it. And that includes providing us with cleaner air. The real problems in towns and cities that get worse as our towns warm from particulate matter, and planting trees in towns and cities is a really good way, if they're done in the right way with the right species, of cleaning our air. Nature can reduce our flooding, both inland and at our coastal areas, and reduce the effects of heat waves by providing blue and green solutions in our towns and cities. So nature provides really good ways of us adapting to climate change. And I do think change may be on the horizon. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about this man, Supatha Dasgupta, who's a very globally well-respected economist, who's produced a report this year on the economics of biodiversity. It's 600 pages long. There's an abridged version, which is still just over 100 pages, but it's full of important evidence that speaks to the business and world finance community. It describes simple truth, that our economies are embedded within nature and not external to it. Most economic models, and the way we've approached nature, is to view it as an infinite resource. And this report has put in very stark economic terms that that's wrong, that's plain wrong, that we need to think about our economy as embedded in nature and fundamentally dependent on it, and adjust our economic models accordingly. I won't go into this in any detail, but essentially he's produced a new economic equation, which seeks to balance nature's supply with humanity's demand. And on the back of that has made a series of really important recommendations about how we can balance the impact of people, largely by increasing nature's supply. So ecological restoration is really important. We need to change how we measure economic success, and we need to transform our institutions and systems to enable and sustain that change. So really big messages that governments are hearing this year. And it is a really important year. I'm just going to turn back to what many are now calling the 2021 super year. The two COPs look like they're going ahead. So the Chinese COP in Kunming will happen in October, and the Glasgow COP will happen almost immediately afterwards, to talk about climate change in November. But there are a range of really important events. I'm sure we're all aware that the UK is currently hosting the G7. The next host of the G7 will be Italy, who's again a really sympathetic partner. There are partners for the COP26, actually. It's a shared conference with Italy. Now, a G7 presidency of the UK followed with an ambitious government at the moment for nature, and Italy is a lot better than what we would have had last year, I would suggest, where we would have had a Trump presidency with the G7 and then a Saudi Arabian G7. And no offense to those countries, but the current leaderships, or the leaderships of those countries, particularly last year, didn't promise very much. We have the G20 under Italy this year as well. That's happening just between the COP15 and COP26. So real chance for change. And I'm sure we're all heartened by some of the big commitments that are coming out from those meetings. At national level, we're seeing strengthening of our legally binding commitments for climate change. So we've now got a 78% reduction target by 2035. When the UK adopted its Climate Change Act back in 2015, it quite possibly helped to encourage other countries to adopt binding net zero commitments, both at the Paris event and subsequently. And my hope is that there's a similar effect for nature. So we'll have a new environment bill in England this year, and the government has promised legally binding targets for nature, including a species abundance target for 2030, where the government's still trying to work out exactly what that will be, but my hope is that it'll be an increased target. So it'll be a bending the curve target. So reckoning that we're currently going down, my hope is that that target will be that we'll stop that decline and begin the recovery, so that we're getting nature positive by 2030. And we have a comprehensive spending review. Now, it's a bit of a boring thing to perhaps nearly end on, but the spending rounds set out the government spend for the next 3 years. And it's essential that this does a lot for nature, that we invest properly in nature if we're going to meet our objectives. What we know is that a 10-year delay in tackling nature will end up costing us twice as much if we then do it, if we then decide to do it. So it's really important that we act early. And if we are going to achieve targets and change by 2030, and a lot of the world is lining up to make important commitments for 2030 at the Kunming conference, then that change needs habitat restoration and improvements now. It can't wait till the last half of the decade, because species simply don't respond that quickly. So it has to be front loaded. These next 3 years are really important if we're going to make that change. So it's hugely challenging, but we all need to feel powerful in this. As churches, we can do a great deal, from looking after our special nature to managing our land. We're big landowners. Maybe we could be places where we'll restore some of that woodland, as the government is trying to do. They're struggling to find land, incidentally, to plant that woodland on. We've made important commitments as a church to get to net zero by 2030, running fast to net zero, and setting the agenda and helping others see that journey is a hugely important thing for the church to do. And I know the church will be present at COP26. And I'm sure faith groups will be well represented at COP15. I gather the Pope has now announced that he'll be in Glasgow for COP26. So faith groups have a really important role to play because of how comprehensive our impacts can be. And of course, you've got a whole week of talks to learn much more about the detail of what churches can do. I also think, churches, risk becoming irrelevant if we don't speak up about climate and the environment. The youth are watching their future disappearing as a result of environmental change, and they're cross about it, and rightly so. And I think the church needs to speak both on their behalf, but also, of course, on behalf of many of the poorer nations around the world that have done least to cause climate change and nature loss, and yet are most affected by it. So this is a justice issue, and the church needs to talk about justice. And then finally, just to say that, do not underestimate how much our choices and voices count. We have huge power in our wallets, and the choices that we make with our wallets. We all need to eat less meat if we still eat meat. That doesn't mean to say cut it out entirely, but we should be eating meat probably once or twice a week instead of 2 or 3 times a day, as many people still seem to do. We need to change our diets. We need to change the way we heat our homes and so on. And that's about choices in our wallets. And I think the economic systems are gearing up to also begin to make these changes. So instead of the most environmentally harmful product being the cheapest thing in the supermarket, over time, I think we'll begin to see changes where those real costs associated with those products are internalized, and that dynamic changes. And then finally, the political decisions made this year will be hugely important. So do tell our politicians that we care. It will make a difference. And I see, I've worked in government now for 20 years, and I think I'm a great believer in policy windows, where evidence that has seemed to just be like a wave against a wall, an impenetrable wall. Suddenly that wall isn't there anymore, and the window's open, and that evidence lands, and politicians listen and make bold choices. I think politicians are ready to make bold choices. They're listening to evidence differently. They'll be worried about the impact of those, and we need to tell them not to worry. We need to tell them that we back them and want them to do more. So I shall end it there. I hope some of that was of interest, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Pete. What a wide-ranging and powerful talk. Thank you very much. It was really interesting, given it is Churches Count on Nature, to see that you had on your slide of solutions connecting people and nature as one of the most important things that we can do. We've got a few minutes for questions. Just to remind everyone, we're putting questions in the Q&A or vote up next to the ones that you already see there. I'm also, just as a risk management measure, going to promote my colleague Jo to being a panelist in case my internet drops out, because it was being a bit dodgy during your talk. But she's just there as backup to me. So the top question at the moment says, how can peat be restored?
Very briefly, by making it wet. So peat, both in lowland and upland areas, has often been dried out, and sometimes for extraction, sometimes for other land management practices to encourage grazing and so on. And so grips, which are basically ditches, have been cut into large amounts of upland peat, and it dries out and it oxidizes and simply blows away. And I see that close to where I live in Peterborough, where we have the fens on our doorstep. And there are days where you drive between fields, and on a windy day after a period of dry spells, it just blows. You almost need to put your windscreen wipers on. You get little dust storms and things. It's drying up, it's blowing away, and oxidizing and becoming carbon dioxide. So we need to keep it wet.
And presumably stop using it on our gardens.
Oh, definitely. Who does that? No, terrible.
The next highest question says, what is the best way to encourage churches to take environmental degradation seriously, especially if they are resistant? Is education the best starting point without seeming to be condemnatory?
I think, well, there's some very good routes to engaging churches and communities. The Eco Church program is fantastic, and I know that's one of the events that Claire talked about. I think Catherine talked about at the start. I think it's fair to say it is a problem if your clergy are a problem. But I get the impression that bishops are increasingly on board and clergy are increasingly coming on board. But there is something about helping people to understand the importance of the fifth mark of mission, which is to be stewards of creation, and embedding that in teaching, embedding that in the church's life, and then thinking about the small steps. Finding a champion within the congregation is really important. You need engines of change, don't you? And those people are hugely inspiring. We have many in my diocese, and I rely on them massively. So I think it's little steps, really, but also encourage people to do. There's a starting point, which is, my church building could never be net zero. There's some brilliant examples of apparently, impossible buildings that have become net zero. Old medieval churches and so on that are becoming net zero. So there's a lot that we can do. I do think nature is a good way in, because nature is a real positive thing to do. It's not stopping something; it's creating beauty, isn't it? And restoring nature in our churches can be a really nice way of bringing communities together, helping people access the church that maybe they haven't recently, and feels a really positive thing to do. So perhaps start with nature.
Yeah. And the Eco Church framework, I think, is a great suggestion, because you can print out the land section of their survey and maybe go through that with a group in your church who's interested in the church grounds, and see what steps you can take. We've got a webinar later in the week on the land section of Eco Church. The next question is a little bit off your topic, but I'll read it to you, Pete, and you can answer it if you wish. What can be done about the rather feeble approach of the church commissioners to divest from fossil fuels? That's a slightly loaded question in the way it's been asked, since there are two sides to this argument. But if you want to comment on it, feel free.
I share the disappointment, I suppose. And some of us joined a conversation with the church commissioners where they argued that actually they feel that they could be, well, I think they argued, others who are present might want to put me right, but they felt they could make a bigger difference by owning shares and in seriously emitting companies and encouraging change, driving change from within is what they feel can make the biggest overall contribution to climate change. And I'll be candid, I think that's quite a weak argument, but there is some merit in that argument, and some evidence that change can happen. I personally think that we need much greater regulation at national and global scales to drive the change, because it's not going to happen quickly enough through voluntary change. And I suppose, if I'm candid as well, I worry that well, my dad's pension is paid by the church commissioners as a previous clergyman, and I have to say that I don't know why they think it's a good investment. With the way the world is going, I think investing in fossil fuel companies will increasingly be poor investments. So I'm not quite sure why they're quite so reluctant to it. But this is an unfair response because they don't have a right to reply, and there are probably very good, sound financial and ethical reasons why they do it.
And their policy is real world engagement followed by divestment by 2023 in any company that's not compliant with the Paris climate obligations. And they've done their first wave of divestments. So I think they are trying to affect real world change through their engagement followed by divestment. Here's a positive question for us to finish on, because we've only got a minute or so left. You touched on this toward the end of your presentation, but what are the best things churches can do to avert the ecological crisis? What would you, if you had a magic wand, what would you love to see every church around the country doing?
Well, do not underestimate the value of our church land. I think churchyards should be messy. They should be wonderful rainbows of places to visit. Bring nature into our towns and cities through our churchyards, and of course in rural areas. So there's huge opportunities for that. The church, I think, I may get this slightly wrong, but we run effectively over a quarter of all primary schools, don't we? And I think 6,000 secondary schools are church schools. So through that impact as well, encouraging that relationship with local schools and what they do on their land, because all of this goes home, all of it goes out. What people see in their churches and happening around church land, does spill out. So don't underestimate how much we can do. But the biggest impact is doubtless what our congregations can bring to political conversations, and showing support for bold action for nature is so key. So yes, dust off your political hats and tell politicians you care. They don't believe that people do largely. It's still not what the door knockers find when they go around saying, what's your top issue? So they need to hear more of it, because we need to encourage them to be bold.
That is a great note to end on, raising our voices for bold action on nature. Apologies to those of you that asked a question we haven't got to it, and it's 1 o'clock. Pete, thank you so much. I knew you would be a great speaker when I twisted your arm to do this, and you've absolutely delivered. That was such an informative, such a powerful talk. I really appreciate it. I'll send Pete's slides around to everybody later today, and when the video is ready, it'll go on our website so that you can share it onwards to your church communities. Please do join some more of our webinars this week. There is all sorts of different topics on there, and I'm sure there'll be things of interest to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
I will save the links in the chat and then bring us to a close.